everyone, welcome back. It's Charlotte from At Charlotte's House. I am super excited to finally be able to share with you this concrete fountain that I made from scratch. It was relatively simple. I love the way it looks. Stay tuned. Years ago, I made a similar concrete fountain, and I love that it was just a sleek concrete orb, but I used a plastic globe, and it occurred to me that especially now with COVID and quarantine, that just finding a thrifted plastic globe was probably a lot easier said than done. So I wanted to make the fountain again, solve some of the problems that I had the first time, but also figure out a way to use a mold that you could buy on Amazon, which I did. I'm using a half sphere mold, aka a hemisphere, that I bought on Amazon, but before I could pour any concrete into it, I needed to create a simple base to hold it steady. There's no magic to this. I just used scrap lumber to make 4 legs and 4 sides that could basically support the mold and hold it steady. Because I wanted to run a hose through the middle of the fountain, I needed to find a way to make a channel in the center of the mold. There's probably a drill bit that would have worked, but the PVC pipe was really cheap and it seemed easy enough to use. I drilled 4 holes into the corners of the mold in order to tie a piece of twine that would hold the PVC pipe steady in the center of the mold. Then I repeated the same thing on the other diagonal. To secure the PVC pipe to the mold and keep it from shifting, I used silicone to hold it in place. I tried as best I could to measure the center point of the mold to ensure that the PVC pipe would go straight through the concrete. Ultimately, I think I just got lucky by eyeballing. I'm always a little bit thrown off by how much composite is in the concrete mix when I open it up. There are so many pebbles and rocks, and I actually was nervous for the first half of this fountain that when I mix it up, I would end up with sort of visible rocks and bumps and dents. So I sifted out the pebbles. I was using only the powdered cement from the bag for the first half. And it looked wonderful, but it used a lot of the mix. So I messaged my friend Ben Uyeda, who is the master of all things concrete, and he assured me that I wouldn't notice the pebbles and everything. So for the second half of the mold, I didn't sift anything out, and of course, he was totally right. Despite all that texture in the mix, when I removed it from the mold, it looked totally smooth and perfect, just like the first half. So now I know. You always need to wear a mask and gloves when you're working with concrete. The powder is dangerous to breathe and it can be pretty rough on your skin. Ideally, you add the water first and then pour the powder into it. But for my setup, it was a lot easier to add the powder and the concrete mix to the bucket and then bring it out to my garden hose. So that's what you're seeing me do here. You want to mix until you have the consistency of like a wet oatmeal. Both halves released from the mold really easily. You'll notice that I ran out of concrete for the second half of this fountain. Note to self, when you sift out all the pebbles, it means that you need more concrete than you expected. Nevertheless, the 2 halves matched up pretty well, but if I ever do this again, obviously I'm going to make sure that I have 2 full molds so that when I put them together, I have a totally matched up sphere. The part of this project that made me the most nervous was getting the 2 PVC pipes to line up. Miraculously, my system worked and the 2 halves joined perfectly. To adhere the 2 hemispheres together, I used some construction adhesive and a wooden dowel to make sure that the 2 halves were lined up. There will always be a crack around the middle with this project, but obviously because my second mold wasn't quite full enough, I had a little bit more of a gap. So I grabbed my Dremel and I carved away that little bit of excess concrete so that the 2 halves would line up a little bit better. I'm using a Quikrete patching material and using my hands and a putty knife to push the patching compound into the crack, and then I smoothed it out as best as I could. They make concrete sanders, but the quick research that I did showed that they could be pretty expensive, and I didn't mind having a slight little bit of texture, so I didn't bother with this, and I just used my hands and the sponge and made the best of it. Okay, time to install the fountain. I dug a hole big enough to hold a standard-sized Home Depot bucket. The bigger this hole and the vessel is, the more water you can hold, which means you don't run the risk of your fountain drying up. I left the top bit of the bucket slightly exposed to prevent any dirt and debris from easily falling into the bucket because this can clog your fountain pump. I cut a piece of metal hardware cloth a few inches wider than the bucket. This will support the river rocks needed to cover the fountain apparatus. Place the fountain pump in the bottom of your bucket. You may need to weigh it down a bit with the rock just to keep it from floating up to the surface. Cut a small hole in the middle of your hardware cloth and then run the tube up through the mesh. Fill your bucket with water. Obviously, the hardware cloth isn't strong enough to support the concrete orb, so I used two 12-inch sections of rebar to support the fountain itself. A second set of hands is really helpful here to help you run the tubing up through the fountain as you're carefully placing it onto the rebar supports. Trim your tubing to the top of the concrete, place the river rocks along the base of the fountain, and enjoy. So one of the things that I want you to notice is that my concrete fountain does have different tones to it. In order to patch the two parts of the concrete, I used this patching compound, and I could easily have used it to cover the entire orb. I chose not to. When it's dry, you can't tell the difference, but I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna turn this on because I'm sure you wanna see how the fountain works. Now that it's turned on, you can see that it's two different colors. I totally don't mind this look. I think it makes it look a little more homemade, a little more rustic. I'm curious to see what happens to this concrete over time, so I'm gonna leave it. If in a month or two I decide that I don't like the look of it, all I need to do is take some of this concrete that I used to patch the seam and just put it along the top, and the whole thing will be this lighter color. But for now, I'm just gonna let it sit. I am so happy with how this fountain turned out. I love how peaceful it is just sitting here. It doesn't take up too much room. It just is a nice, quiet little moment in our garden, and that's exactly what I wanted. My kids' favorite thing to do is to come out here and turn the fountain on, and they are very disappointed that I don't have it going higher. They want this thing to be shooting into the sky. Personally, this is exactly what I want. I love the water just gently sort of falling over the orb itself. But if you have kids like mine and you want to shoot it into the sky, you do you. If you click the link in my video description, it'll take you over to my website where I have a full written tutorial along with links to all the supplies that I use. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you click that little bell icon, you will get a notification when I upload videos in the future. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day, everyone.